Hello everyone, this is Nokwe from Birds of Play, in the flesh for the first time on the channel. Sorry if you're disappointed I'm not an actual bird. The reason for my flesh-like appearance is that this week's video is going to be a little bit different from what we usually do on the channel, since I was doing a film studies conference yesterday, or a talk at a film studies conference, and like most events these days, the conference was held online, which was sort of a shame because I didn't get to meet all the lovely people. On the upside, however, that means I have a recording of my talk to share with you that I've also spiced up a little bit in post-production to make it a little bit more fun, if that's the word. So I hope you enjoy the talk. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll hopefully see you on the other side. Enjoy! Hello everyone, my name is Nokwe and I'm a PhD student here at the university. My research focus is mainly on video games, and I almost exclusively do work within the academic field of game studies. My main area of interest being Japanese role-playing games and Japanese games and gaming culture in general. In this relatively short talk, however, I'm going to be contemplating in what ways we should or could conceive of the relationship between a game series such as the Final Fantasy series of games and the art of cinema or the medium of cinema. As it says in the title of my talk, this is a sort of preliminary study, meaning that it's not intended to represent any form of mature research on the subject. Instead, I'm hoping that this might become a gateway or a jumping off point for me and or others that might be interested in pursuing this line of argument further, or this line of questioning, since the relationship between cinema and games in general is quite fascinating, I think. While at the same time being a somewhat underdeveloped area of study, at least when you factor in to what extent the interests of these two seemingly distinct forms of mediation can really be said to align. Most modern AAA video games, for example, featuring direct in-game cinematics, whether they are pre-rendered in much the same way as classic Pixar films, or rendered in real time by utilizing the graphical capabilities of the hardware itself. That's not to say that there hasn't been any academic work done on the subject. It's just that it doesn't seem to reflect the full scope or the full extent of this cross-contamination or the way that games and cinema have influenced one another. One of the reasons for this, I believe, has to do with academic politics to some degree, especially in the case of game studies. Game studies being a relatively young field, even in comparison to film studies, and has had to fight hard to justify its own existence. And one of the strategies that was adopted was to distance the study of games from the study of other forms of mediation, such as film and literature. Another reason might be a lack of interdisciplinary understanding, and that's why it's really interesting for someone like me that has only dabbled in film studies to be able to give a talk at a venue like this that is dedicated to the study of film. So hopefully you lovely people at home or wherever you are will be able to give me some insights or ask me some interesting questions that might enable me to explore these issues even further. But before we go any further, what is Final Fantasy? Well, Final Fantasy is a massively popular Japanese role-playing game series that's been around for a very long time, at least compared to most video game franchises. The first game being released all the way back in 1987, which coincidentally corresponds to the year that I was born, making it very fitting that I spent so much of my time both enjoying and analyzing Final Fantasy games. This makes Final Fantasy one of the longest running video game franchises in the world, even though I'm not one of the longest living human beings in the world. But it's not only notable for its age, since it's also quite a prolific video game series, with 15 mainline titles and counting, Final Fantasy XVI already having been announced. Not to mention a large number of spin-off titles and some sequels. It's also a very influential series, often being credited as not only the series that popularized Japanese role-playing games in the West, but also a series that has greatly altered the way people think of video games as a medium for storytelling, a feat that was at least in part accomplished by relying on cinematic techniques. As such, starting to think about the relationship between cinema and games by looking at the Final Fantasy series isn't just me peddling my favorite video game franchise, since the series does seem to display a certain or a special affinity with film, as well as having been and continuing to be quite central to the gaming landscape. In this book, Power Up, How Japanese Video Games Gave the World an Extra Life, game journalist Chris Kohler has argued that Final Fantasy has always had a flair for the cinematic, extending the cinematic history of Final Fantasy way past modern cinematics or 3D graphics, and making a case that even during the era of the original Nintendo Entertainment System, the Final Fantasy series was breaking cinematic ground in regard to games by employing movie-like techniques. He credits Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the series and the director of the first 5 games, with making the game more like a movie by letting the story start in media res, or already in the thick of things, letting the players find out for themselves what their quest entails, much like a movie audience would be expected or asked to fill in the gaps in the narrative during the opening of a film. Kohler also points out how delaying the opening credits mimics certain films, as well as positions the game developers as people worthy of recognition for their work, much like has become customary in films. Kohler then goes on to explore the evolution of these movie-like techniques in the Final Fantasy series in a somewhat compelling manner. I nevertheless wonder whether the subject couldn't be addressed more systematically and with a bit more of an academic mindset as opposed to a journalistic one. Not that there's anything wrong in particular with the journalistic approach. In fact, a very large proportion of productive writing on gaming is journalistic, and we would be foolish to ignore it. That should, however, not in any way discourage those of us that are more academically inclined, or those of us that belong to the academic sphere, from our noble quest of being pretentious jerks that think we know better than everybody else. And to that end, I have tried to take Kohler's analysis and put a bit of a more systematic spin on it by dividing them up into 3 separate categories for further study. The first one is authorial intent, as he mentions Sakaguchi as someone that is able to execute his creative vision. The second is textual analysis, or whatever we should call it, really. Text in this sense is not limited to written text, as in words on a page, but rather represents a set of coherent signs that can be navigated in different ways depending on the text in question. When it comes to video games, you sometimes hear the term cybertext to describe the way they offer different opportunities for navigation. And where was I? So that kind of textual analysis in this case just means looking at the games themselves as a set of signifiers and to ascertain to what extent they can be said to be cinematic. Lastly, we have an approach that I've dubbed media ecology. And what I mean by that in regard to researching the relationship between games and cinema is looking into the ontological understanding of different media, or the how the nature of games is perceived, and how different media relates to one another not only in general terms but also in culturally specific terms, meaning that how the differences and interactions between games and cinema are perceived in regard to the development and reception might be different in places like Japan compared to Europe or the States, for instance, resulting in different output of cultural artifacts belonging to these forms of media, depending on their cultural background. So we might have different ideas about what a game is or what a film is. Even though I present these 3 categories as separate directories for further study, I think there is significant overlap between them, at least when it comes to what they might be said to cover. But even though they might share some objects to be researched, they nevertheless frame them in a different way, thereby shedding light on different characteristics of the whole picture, so to speak. So, starting with authorial intent, we can see a substantial opportunity for further research by employing auteur theory, typically reserved for film directors, by looking at game directors and other developers that are part of the collaborative process of making games that still retain a specific style or a thematic preoccupation that is possible for them to be recognized by. Unlike that of literature or film, the history of games is fraught with unrecognized developers, the most famous pushback against this being Warren Robinet's famous Easter egg that he hid in the game Adventure from 1980 that simply read, "Created by Warren Robinet," as a result of Atari refusing to credit him for his work. And it's a fun fact that that little Easter egg took up 5% of the total memory that was available to the game, which might indicate that Robinet really wanted to take credit for his work in some way, or at least that he felt inclined to do so given the chance. At the other hand of the spectrum, we do have game directors that are often thought of as auteurs, the most notable of these being Hideo Kojima, best known for the Metal Gear series, and more recently Death Stranding. We could also try to push Yoko Taro in there, even though he's a bit more of a niche director. But exploring the notion of auteurs further in relation to a broader array of directors and developers would nevertheless be beneficial, as it would help lift the veil of the human aspect of game development a little bit. Starting with Sakaguchi, we can start by taking note of Kohler's observations about the movie-like techniques employed in the early Final Fantasy titles, noting how they get reused and developed further throughout Sakaguchi's career. We can also note Sakaguchi's cinematic ambitions that reached their all-time high with the release of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, an ambitious, albeit somewhat flawed, computer-animated science fiction film that was directed by Sakaguchi. It was a really ambitious film, at least from a technological standpoint, and before its financial failure, Square, the company behind Final Fantasy and the film, had plans of making Aki Ross, the main character of the film, into the first photorealistic computer-animated actress, letting her make appearances in multiple films, just like a real actress would. These plans, however, never came to fruition, and Sakaguchi hasn't directed another film since. But in order to better understand Sakaguchi's style as a director, it might be illuminating to look at how other Final Fantasy directors have handled the series. For example, we can look at Tetsuya Nomura's work on Final Fantasy VIII, where he wasn't actually the game's director, but rather the character designer, but he nevertheless directed the opening cinematic for the game. And in the opening cinematic, we can see Nomura's propensity for creating a sense of mystery. Even though I personally don't like to make the comparison, it could be said that Nomura's approach to directing is somewhat reminiscent of J.J. Abrams' mystery box philosophy, wherein creating a sense of mystery and suspense is key. The difference, however, in my mind, is that Nomura's mystery boxes almost always have some substance to them, no matter how convoluted it may be. But bringing the discussion back in-house, we can see that even within the Final Fantasy series itself, there are distinct differences between how different creators approach the development of these games, and it would be really interesting to see a fuller analysis of these differences and these directors. But moving on to the textual analysis, we are invited to take a look at how these games can be said to directly emulate or be evocative of cinema. And I think we can further subcategorize at least some of the things that might be of interest to us within this textual framework. The first would be pure cinematics, meaning instances of uninterrupted cinematic action. This would include most traditional cutscenes. Secondly, we have these cinematic hybrids, wherein pre-configured cinematics run parallel to player input in some way. And lastly, we can take a look at how the gameplay itself is directed and whether it can be said to be cinematic in some way. Over its long history, Final Fantasy has displayed all of these different approaches to cinematic gaming. We can of course name other games, such as Heavy Rain or Detroit Become Human, developed by Quantic Dream, not to mention games by Hideo Kojima that are more explicitly cinematic, but the question of the relationship between cinema and games is not interesting, at least not to me, as simply a question of which games are most openly cinematic, but rather as an invitation to see how the balance is struck in different ways, as well as what form and function in-game cinematics can be said to serve. One function that cinematics often serve, for example, especially if you're a bit jaded, is to advertise games. Cinematic adverts, to a substantial degree, accounting for the rise in in-game cinematics over the years, showing the most visually impressive images that are available at the time. But in-game cinematics are of course also a question of artistic choice, and it's very interesting to see how this part of the developer's toolkit is leveraged in different ways by different creators. And just like looking further into the directors and developers of Final Fantasy games constitutes an interesting opportunity for further research, the way these elements are presented in different games also presents a viable path for further exploration. Lastly, we come to the question of Final Fantasy and its relationship to the media ecology of Japan. And it is at this point that we are invited to ponder, or at least think about, why these sort of story-driven games, or perhaps even partly cinematic games, seem to be popularized first and foremost by Japanese video games, and role-playing games in particular, I think, which in itself is a sort of a bold claim that would need to be backed up even further, so that in itself posits another topic for further study. But looking at the Japanese media landscape, we can see a lot of collaborations and interdependency between different forms of media, such as film, games, comics, music, and merchandising in general. In Japan, these collaborations are sometimes referred to as media mix strategies, and this cohabitation being one of the reasons Japanese game developers have been more open, perhaps, to adapt elements typically associated with other media. Another reason, however, might be that in this particular media climate, the ontological question of what a game actually is or should be might have a somewhat different answer in comparison to other places. I just beat my screen up. In an article entitled "A Fantasy Without a Dream, Japanese Role-Playing Games and the Absence of the Expressive Ideal," I have already made the case that the evolutionary history of Japanese and Western role-playing games has differed significantly in terms of their ultimate goal. I won't be able to summarize it all at this time, but in quite simple terms, it's just saying that Western role-playing games have emphasized player choice to a more substantial degree, player agency being a more prominent part of the genre definition itself that has shaped the production and reception of such games. This means that we might be able to further speculate that Japan's particular brand of media ecology might have been instrumental in regard to the Final Fantasy series, as well as other Japanese role-playing games having adopted cinematic elements, and also that those cinematic elements might be further influenced by the particular type of cinema and other media that is prevalent in Japan. But this is of course speculative, and further work would need to be done in order to substantiate such claims. And that's all I have for you today. As I said, just a preliminary study, just getting my toes a little wet before hopefully diving in at some point. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And incidentally, this is the game over screen from Final Fantasy VII, so I think we can safely assume that the developers aren't completely in the dark about how their games are in some way cinematic. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for watching and listening. So, I hope you enjoyed the talk. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them down in the comments below. And also, since you stuck through the whole thing and I still have you here with me, I wanted to ask you another question, since Christmas came a little bit early for me and I got some Final Fantasy books in the mail, and I have 2 of them here with me now, and I wanted to ask your opinion on which one I should start with. The first one is the psychology of Final Fantasy, and the second one is Final Fantasy and philosophy. So, which one should I start with? Vote down in the comments below, and hope to see you again next time. Goodbye. Oh, sorry, bird sounds. I have to